Welcome to A Shot in the Arm podcast. It's day 3 of the World Health Assembly, the 29th of May, and today we're going to take a look at what's been going on these last few days and get some really interesting insights from our guest. She is a German-based global health advocate and strategist. She has made a real name for herself actually in the digital media sphere, particularly on LinkedIn with her incisive posts and comments. And she's also an alumni of UNAIDS briefly, although she and I did not cross paths. I am really thrilled, finally, after years of trying to organise this, to welcome Katri Bertram to A Shot in the Arm podcast. Hey, Katri, how are you doing?
Hi, Ben. It's such a privilege to be here, and I'm so happy we've made this happen.
Oh, right back at you. I have been really impressed at the posts and the blogs you have written over the last few years. You seem to capture, how shall I put it, the feelings behind the data, the developments. And I just sort of wonder up front, if you could say a little bit about your career and how that brought you to this place and an influencer on LinkedIn.
Ben, you're embarrassing me. It's funny because I get a lot of comments on my blogs and my writing. And the way I started on social media and when I started writing longer formats in the form of blogs, it was primarily for myself just to kind of sort my thoughts and figure out what is going on in the sector and why is something off and why are things feeling strange. And then I decided to put them out in the public space because I thought, well, maybe I'm not the only one thinking these things. And throughout these years that I've been writing and blogging and tweeting and posting things, I've realized there's a huge community of people out there, especially in our sector, who are wondering exactly these same things and who have then been reaching out and saying, I'm so glad I'm not alone with these concerns or reflections or thoughts. And that's been a really, really wonderful feeling to realize that these discussions are actually happening globally. They're happening in all countries, in all institutions. Many people are just really scared to speak out or even admit that they are having these concerns and thoughts. And you asked about my career. So I've been working in this space for around 20 years. I'm a political scientist, an economist by training. I slipped into health not because I'm interested in the technicalities, but because there is a mission that I think all of us are working towards collectively, which is creating a healthy population and more well-being. And I love this sector. I love this space. I love the people who work in it. But I have huge concerns about what is going on and how things are developing.
And I want to really get to that in the second part of this podcast. But first up, your take on what's going on here. Yesterday, the World Health Assembly gave consideration to progress made on the pandemics accord. Don't you like my UN language?
Good press release language.
Yes, the press release-ish. And then also the fact that these international health regulations are hopefully moving forward this week. Do you see this as progress, or are you concerned that it's sort of same old, passing the buck down the line?
Yeah, I guess, I've been here for a couple of days, as most of us have been, and we're hearing two stories on this. One is the optimistic, we're still here, we're still together, we're still talking in this geopolitical and kind of political place that we're in 2024. And that is already in itself a good thing. And we haven't yet given up fully on either the IHR amendments or the pandemic agreement. We haven't fully given up on the WHO either, which is the positive spin. I think the other kind of story that I'm hearing, and which I'm probably feeling myself, is same. We are not moving and we're not getting anywhere in terms of progress, and we might actually be regressing. And that's hugely concerning. So a couple of things I heard on panels, which I found insightful. Yesterday, there was a panelist who said, I was preparing for this speech. I looked at my talking points from 15 years ago, and I could have just used all of those again. And that was incredibly depressing. And there was another panelist in another session who said, This is my 8th WHA. I really don't know if I want to come back for a 9th and a 10th one. And I think that people are expressing these concerns on a public stage already says something in itself. But I'd still like to go back to that point on regress. So there's a lot of talk about progress in our sector because our sector loves the word progress. We want to have impact. We want to see all of those mortality figures decrease, and we want to see more health. But we're really bad at talking about the regress that's happening. So stagnation of a lot of data, discrimination against groups whom we had accessed and kind of protected and reached over the last decades. Issues such as gender being contested, issues such as LGBTQI populations being stigmatized or even threatened legally or with their lives. And I don't think there's enough space for that recognition of what's going on in the world and how to address that kind of rolling back that we're seeing.
Could you talk a bit more about gender? Because we're seeing that a number of member states are opposed to any use of the term, and the UN is coming up with some very strange sort of analogies for gender health, gender rights. Do you see the pushing back of sexual and reproductive health as a center point of this, or is it perhaps more of a rejection of Western and Northern influence in development policy?
I think it's much broader than sexual and reproductive health. And I think it's much broader than what's just going on in the UN and what's going on here this week at WHA or even in the WHO context. So for anyone who works in the gender space, it's happening everywhere. And it's not just about women and girls. It's kind of questioning the whole concept of identity. And if you look at issues such as trans rights, I mean, that's really where the heated discussions are happening. And I think we as a health community often think gender is only sexual and reproductive rights. It's only about maternal kind of issues because that's a health issue. And we're kind of missing the storyline that is happening in the rest of the world, which is really about gender identity. And how are we defining people and who has rights to define other people and who has rights to define themselves. So I would see it in a much broader context. And I think that's even more concerning because that means the discrimination and the rolling back is not just on issues such as abortion and family planning. It's on issues such as, are you allowed to be the person you need to be and who you really are? And I think that's where it gets really tricky, right? Because if you look at the global debates, for example, on trans, hormone treatments of adolescents, super, super contested at the moment, even in high-income countries. So it's not just a question of, is this a Western model? These issues are being debated in the US, in the UK, everywhere. And it's, I think, a reflection of that confusion in part. What do we mean by this? And a huge sense of insecurity for some countries and leaders on, do we want to have a society that looks like this?
And of course, many of our governments and members of the World Health Assembly do not want that. In one of your most recent posts, you spoke about dire times, and I suppose a little bit of a sense of exhaustion on your part coming back here this year, and seeing the stagnation, which I think is absolutely right, is the right word to describe what's going on here. I was wondering whether you feel it is possible to ring-fence health, whether it's the WHO, whether it's the work of UNAIDS or other specialized agencies, and sort of ring-fence the health work from the sort of broader geopolitical tectonic splits. And I've heard conflicting views, but I just wondered where you come down on this.
I'm a political scientist, so I'd say that's not even possible, right? I mean, I know there are two communities, and WHO is an organization that is filled with scientists and technocrats and people who say, well, we have the data, we know the evidence, and therefore, that's kind of our space, and we shouldn't become political, right? I don't think everybody in WHO agrees with that, and maybe the kind of current leadership doesn't agree with that either. But many member states as well think WHO should only be doing that and should ignore everything else that's happening in the world. And then there are a lot of people who are driven by what I spoke about, the mission of these organizations and why probably most of us work in this space, which is to ensure that people are healthy. And as we know, most interventions are not in the health sector that affect people's health. So therefore, you can't disconnect those two areas. And if you look at what is affecting people's physical, mental, every aspect of their health, it's things like wars, it's things like climate change and the anxiety that's around it, it's things like poverty and social injustice. And so in my opinion, you can't disconnect the two. And it would be, I would even say, naive to do so. And I would take it even further and say it's quite dangerous to do so. Because if we continue to just operate the way we do in our kind of technical, evidence-based way and say, we'll just ignore what's happening in the world, I think we're also complacent to letting things happen if we don't address the factors that are highly, highly political, and if we don't engage with that space as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I suppose the big challenge for us who are committed to improving health equity and improving access to this wonderful revolution, technological revolution that is of clinical science. How do we remain positive? How do we remain focused on the goals? And it seems to me that if there are a sort of a fracture in the, say, global economic order, global security order, that's inevitably going to affect us. And it comes back to, I think, the comment you made at the start around we are obsessed with data showing progress. And in fact, we need to be thinking about utilizing data showing regression to mobilize us more. Coming back to the pandemic accord, were you surprised coming out of COVID that countries in the European Union, the United States and the UK, that sense of vaccine nationalism that emerged during COVID seems to be driving some of the positioning, certainly around intellectual property? I had thought we had, in the HIV field, had addressed that a long time ago, but it's back with a vengeance.
It's back with a vengeance, and I would say it's been back for longer than we think. It didn't just start with the pandemic. So when I look at some of my old blogs, I started writing in 2013, so nearly 10 years ago. I started writing about nationalism and the impact on global health already around the first years of the Syria war. And there was the big refugee crisis and the migration kind of issues that were hitting Europe for the first time. And I was in Germany at the time. And that's when the nationalist backlash really, really kicked in because people were overwhelmed and there was a political polarization that took place, whether we should take up the refugees or whether they should just leave Europe. And the nationalist forces won. If you look at what happened in Europe, the European borders were set up. There were agreements with Turkey so that people wouldn't even be able to get into Europe. And at the time, working and reflecting on these issues, I thought, oh, no, that's going to happen in health. We saw it a bit with Ebola. We saw it with some travel ban issues, which were happening in parallel at the same time. So in some way, I wasn't at all surprised for that reason, because the political environment was already quite nationalistic, quite self-interested. It wasn't about solidarity even before. And I think there was a second aspect that was also I think, always there, which was the power of money and the power of private sector lobbyists that have been hugely influential in many of the governments that were in place around the time of the pandemic. So if you look at the parties in Europe, in the US and Canada, and most of high-income countries, they were kind of center-left, but a bit more center-right. And I think the power of the private sector was very strong already before the pandemic started, and it really kicked in. And there was a huge lobby effort as well to make sure that those interests wouldn't be threatened. So in some way, I wasn't surprised at all, but it was hugely shocking, I think, for most of us that political leadership and decision makers made a decision to not do a fundamental transformational shift and say, this is once in a kind of decade, in our lifetime, maybe the first time we're experiencing this, we need to do something differently. We kind of need to have all hands on deck, think about global solidarity, look at the evidence that this pandemic will take longer, cost more lives if we are nationalistic, if we just, obsess about IP rights. And I think that was shocking to see that very, very few political leaders sided with people, and most sided with the kind of money and power. And I think you had it in your last podcast, or the LinkedIn Live session that you had. I think Jeff said, at the end of the day, it all comes down to money and power. And I think that's what we saw in the pandemic and what we are seeing in a continued form in the pandemic agreement negotiations.
I mean, I want to stay ever so slightly optimistic here that we haven't achieved this argument. We haven't won the argument, but there is something to be said in utilizing the self-interest argument when it comes to pandemics, and that what happens to a mine worker in South Africa will hit a steel worker in Ohio very shortly afterwards in this world of mass population movements. And yet it is interesting that we aren't able to articulate solidarity in a self-interested way. You're based in Berlin. You're German.
Actually not. I'm from Finland, but yes, I've been
Blimey, really?
Yes, but I've been in Berlin for a long time.
Somebody didn't do their research properly. Because I was going to say that you have, I think fairly uniquely, an incredible insight into the German Weltanschauung, the sort of the worldview of what's going on, particularly as it relates to global health. And I wondered if I might, just for a few minutes, pick your brain about that. Because Germany, whether it likes it or not, has been thrust into the international scene in a way that it really hasn't wanted to during the post-war compact, and is now, a major leader in global health, whether it is the Global Health Hub, whether it is the partnership with WHO. And I just wondered what your reflections are on that, and what advice you might give some of us thinking that Germany is an untapped pot of gold.
Yeah, where all the other pots of gold are disappearing as budgets are cut. Yeah, I think to your point that Germany was kind of thrust into this role. It wasn't its own decision to say, we really think this is a great area and we want to do more in it. It kind of became a global health leader by default because other countries dropped off over the last couple of years. I mean, Trump having the presidency and leaving the WHO and kind of dropping funding on a lot of areas suddenly made Germany the top government funder of WHO, which I don't think most of the government realized for a couple of months. And they definitely didn't want to make it public. They were sort of kind of embarrassed and for whatever reasons. So I'd say they were kind of a reluctant leader. They felt very uncomfortable with this position and always kept saying no, even under Merkel's chancellorship. She said, we're here, to help set the agenda, but this is a collective effort. So the language that we often hear in the Anglo-Saxon world, in America and the UK, of we are proud leaders and we lead on global health. Germany has never liked that language and has never liked the feeling of we should take more responsibility, as has been the same case in many of the kind of foreign policy areas and also in development aid. But the fact is, Germany kind of by default is one of the biggest countries in this space at the moment, as has been setting the agenda. And for example, in the pandemic became a hugely important player because it had the kind of pharmaceutical companies as well, and suddenly was a veto player in this space, as it has been together with the European Union and the pandemic agreement negotiations. And again, I don't think this was something that was by design. They just kind of happened to be in that space and said, oh dear, what do we do? And we kind of feel uncomfortable with it. I think many people who are not in Germany still think, and maybe it's true for the current moment, that Germany is much more stable and kind of a sane space in this current world where we're looking at a US election that looks really dire. The UK is just been nuts for years. Many of the other kind of huge countries with big populations are as well having difficult elections right now. And Timothy Garton-Ash had an article about Germany in I think it was in the New York Review just a while back, which said, with all its faults, like Germany is still a pretty normal country. They're still doing things the kind of sane way. They're still investing into development assistance. They're still taking, the WHO seriously. There's a team at the German Health Ministry, which really, really is committed to strengthening WHO as well. On the other hand, if you look at the political dynamics that are at play in Germany at the moment, we're seeing a lot of extreme right-wing nationalists polling extremely high. Some of the state governments have already been taken over by a extreme right-wing nationalist party. Some people would call it just outright Nazi. And I think that will shift the dynamic really fast over the next years, and probably is already. So we're, for example, already seeing issues that took place in the US and the UK a few years ago, development aid being hugely contested. Why should we help, like you said, that South African miner? Not our problem, won't affect us. We can just protect ourselves. And the narrative is shifting in the political dialogue, and it's starting to affect the big parties. So in the same way that in the US, the Tea Party kind of impacted the Republican Party in the debates and what is acceptable, we're starting to see that in Germany as well, that some of the traditional larger parties are starting to use language to kind of vie for those right-wing voters, and are getting really uncomfortable with issues such as global health, and starting to use some of that polarized populist rhetoric, for example, even on issues such as refugees, WHO, and whatnot. So we're seeing that feed in. So that pot of gold that I think everyone is looking at, and I get lots of requests, can you advise us? How do we access all this money that is there? How do we access this great government that is so supportive? And the reality is it's really tricky. Budgets are being cut in Germany as well, and global health budgets will be cut there most likely as well. So that pot of gold, it might be there for maybe a year or two still, and it's going to, again, a very pessimistic outlook, maybe not be there anymore soon.
So just a couple of final questions, if I may. First up, what is your sense of how Ukraine is impacting the German dialogue around global health, or health more generally? Because we saw the Russian tactic of explicitly targeting health infrastructure, and unfortunately, for better or for worse, we're seeing similar tactics in the Gaza.
Yeah, I think on Ukraine, the situation is a lot easier. Gaza is a real hot potato and a difficult territory, but Germany sided very strongly with the Ukraine, and at the time as well, the health kind of support was really, really important for the German government. So I think that's been quite easy in some way. There's been a lot of support. We've taken in a lot of refugees from the Ukraine, and that's not contested at the moment. You mentioned Gaza. There, the government stance has been very, very difficult because there is a whole history that comes with Germany and its Second World War position and saying never again, and we're never again going to question anything that Israel does. That's how far it's been taken. And where we've seen those shifts in other governments, such as the U.S. and many other kind of Western democracies, where they've said enough is enough. We're seeing hospitals being bombed. The Economist this week had all the statistics verified on women and children deaths, civilian deaths. That hasn't quite entered the space of what is tolerated. I mean, you cannot speak about these issues in Germany, and it's really tricky. So we're seeing this discrepancy. People who believe in humanitarian aid and protecting life and civilians, we're seeing such a discrepancy between the how Ukraine was supported and how Gaza, they don't really know what to do with it.
And I think to some degree that's a common feeling across the political spectrum in many countries, but of course acute in Germany. Well, one final question. What else are you looking at? What's on your radar for the rest of this week at the World Health Assembly?
Yeah. I think most people are caught up with the pandemic accord headlines and maybe might be looking at AHR as like a concrete deliverable that something at least was agreed to. But I think two things have kind of dropped off the radar, which are also hugely important. First is the investment case, which was launched on Sunday, and which really, I think, will determine whether WHO is better placed to do its work or even able to do much of what it's done so far. And it's a hugely ambitious goal. The fundraising space, even institutions that have fundraising machines that are 1,000 times bigger than what WHO have, are worried they're not meeting their goals, and they probably won't meet their goals. So there's a big question mark on whether WHO will achieve any of its targets. I think most of us hope it will, but it's going to be a really, really tough year. And then the second issue, which I think most people haven't quite gotten their head around, is the next global program of work, which doesn't sound very exciting. It's like a long document of different targets and 6 objectives and hundreds of outcome indicators and whatnot. But ultimately, it's a proposition to change and expand WHO's mandate. Mm-hmm. So, for example, climate change is suddenly one of the kind of objectives, which I think many of us believe is absolutely critically important for health. But there's a big question mark on whether WHO should be doing so much in that space and if what it should be doing. And there are many areas that are contested. And there is a kind of stretching of the mandate, especially in a resource-constrained environment, that is going to be really, really tricky for WHO to balance. So I think those are 2 issues beyond the kind of geopolitical aspects that we're seeing that will determine whether WHO will be a useful organization in not even in the long run, like whether it's going to be a useful organization in a couple of years' time. And I think two aspects that are really worth following too.
Well, thank you. And we'll be watching very closely your reflections and analysis of this, and maybe we can get you back on the podcast in the future to reflect on where we've got to. Katri, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and I've really enjoyed it. And I, as I said at the start, we've been trying to get this podcast together for a good couple of years, and I'm so grateful that we've been able to do it in person. So, Katri, you are a shot in the arm.
Thank you, Ben.
Well, that's it for this episode. We will be back with more episodes from the World Health Assembly. But in the meantime, don't forget to subscribe, give us 5 stars, and have a great day and a safe day, everyone.